Okay, so maybe it'll come on all of a sudden. Anyway, thanks so much for coming, guys. This is our 4th meetup, Static Web Tech Meetup, and we're really excited today as Foundation 6 has chosen to work with a static site generator intimately as part of the setup. And Geoff right here from ZURB Foundation is here to tell us more about it, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Please keep clapping. Well, thank you. So my name's Geoff from ZURB once again. Those are my first 2 slides, so I already blew that part. First off, thank you so much, guys, for having us. We're going to have a lot of fun today talking about Node and static sites, those kinds of things, so let's get into it. So today, for my talk, I'm going to talk about the ZURB template, which is a kind of new thing that we rolled out along with Foundation 6. It's basically a way for users of Foundation to use the same tools that ZURB uses to deliver front-end code to clients. And we do that through the Gulp task runner and also a custom templating thing that we wrote called Panini. Together, the two form a delicious build system. So I'm Geoff Kimball. Those are @ you can look at. I am a designer and a front-end developer at ZURB. ZURB is a little agency in Campbell, California, near San Jose. So we work with companies both large and small on many kinds of design problems. We also maintain open source projects on the side. So we've been very heavily invested in open source for like 5 or 6 years, mainly with the Foundation framework. Do any of you guys out there use Foundation in your projects? Okay, I know what framework you guys all use. So we maintain Foundation, which these days is actually 3 different open source projects. And a lot of these just arose out of needs that we kind of identified within our company. So Foundation for Sites is the OG Foundation. Version 6 was released in November of last year. It was probably our biggest release to date. We did kind of a fundamental rethinking of how the framework was structured. We were really aggressively cutting file size. We cut our CSS from 160 kilobytes minified to 50 kilobytes. So that was like a 2/3 kind of drop in file size, which is amazing. We had a similar cost savings for our JavaScript. We took a hard look at how a lot of our components were structured, like ones that we've had for years, but maybe didn't feel useful or felt like they needed to be repurposed. And we also thought a lot about the ecosystem around Foundation, which is where the ZURB template comes into play. We also have Ink, which is our responsive email framework, which is meant to take the hassle out of writing tables for responsive emails. That's been rebranded as Foundation for Emails. And then Foundation for Apps is our kind of Angular spin on Foundation, which is more oriented towards writing software versus basic websites. But today, we will mostly be talking about Foundation 6. So let's talk about Panini. This is a Node library that we developed specifically for the ZURB template to solve the very specific problem of compiling flat files from a bunch of elementary pieces. So for about 2 years, ZURB used an internal template for client work, which was powered by Grunt and Assemble. So this was something that at first was actually just another branch of a template we had. And whenever you'd start work at ZURB, they'd be like, what do you use for client work? It's like, okay, we'll go find this branch of this one thing. That's what most people use. Eventually, we standardized that into a client template, but we kept it a secret because nobody else should know about how we deliver code. So with the launch of Foundation 6, we knew that we wanted kind of a more robust ecosystem around the framework. We wanted more tools to help people get started quickly. So that's why we came up with more templates. We developed a full GUI called Yeti Launch, which is similar to CodeKit or Kitematic. It's basically a GUI that allows you to spin up Foundation projects without having a full dev environment set up. We're really big on trying to kind of make our ideas accessible to people. So with that, we said, well, why don't we take the tools that we're going to use to deliver Foundation 6 code to clients and just give that to our user base? Because there's really nothing secret about it. There's no server passwords. There's no weird configuration in there. We tend to use the same tools that any other web developer would use. So why don't we distribute that to people? So we use that mainly to deliver static HTML. So ZURB is not a dev shop in client work. We mostly do design work. So when we do front end, we're very focused on pattern libraries. So we will deliver static HTML to clients, and we will deliver a really kick-ass set of CSS components, all written in Sass, very well organized, and all very well documented with a custom style guide that we designed just for that client. And we do all of that with our client template. So we wanted to take all those bells and whistles, the things that we use in our internal process, and we wanted to give those to the community. Right? So why not share that with people? Wish that GIF was not that small. I blame reveal.js. So by making our own client stack public, this allows us to do a few things. One is we can more effectively dog food our tools. because here now we're saying, okay, like this thing is valuable, but here's why, right? Because this is something that we use for our client work, and we need to make sure that it is worthwhile. So by putting it out in the open, we also can get more community feedback on it. They can help us fix bugs, which they definitely have done already, which is very nice. And it also can make our users feel cool, because they're using things a cool design agency uses. So we were kind of big on that. That's mostly a marketing thing, but we were definitely big on that too. This idea of like, here's the thing we use, right? Like we didn't make this in a vacuum. This is designed around a very specific purpose, and we are now giving that scaffold to our user base. So what does our build system do? So in Foundation 5, we used Grunt for a lot of stuff. Grunt powered all of the different tasks we needed for the Foundation framework itself, and Grunt also powered our client template. In making the shift from 5 to 6, pretty much across the board, we switched our choice of task runner from Grunt to Gulp. A lot of that is because we kind of like the mental model of it for, admittedly, it was hot at the time, as now like NPM scripts are, but we still like Gulp. We like it because it's a series of tubes. Do any of you guys here like use Gulp in like any of your build systems, or hands? Cool. Gulp is a fine tool. And not just because it's trendy. It's legitimately a very nice tool. Gulp 4 is coming out soon, and it's making a lot of improvements to kind of how that thing works. So definitely worth checking out. Here's kind of an overview of what the template does. Breaking things down like this kind of helps us understand the different pieces, and this will be important later in the presentation when I talk about the concept of modularity. So you can kind of break down the things you'd maybe need out of a static site into a few categories. Probably one of the biggest ones is you need HTML processing. So that's where Panini would come in. The next few things is that you need ways to process and optimize your assets. So 3 core ones for us are Sass, JavaScript, and images. Right? So Sass, we run through a lot of different things. We run through a Sass compiler. We run through auto prefixers, so we don't have to write Moz and WebKit prefixes. We run it through CSS Nano to compress the CSS. And then one final machete we take to the code is we use uncss, which is a tool that can scan your HTML and prune CSS you never actually used. This is a problem for people who use large frameworks because often people will use frameworks as is. They will not customize them. So they might be deploying a site with like a 60, 70 kilobyte framework, and they're only using like 10 kilobytes of it. And that's a huge like waste of file size, especially as mobile becomes more prominent in the web world. So we decided to also bundle uncss with our tool set as a way to help developers get some of that extra functionality to say, okay, we are going to make your CSS as aggressively optimal as we can. And we're going to do it by giving you this boilerplate. Then the next is JavaScript and images, which we run through different compressors. We use Uglify for JavaScript. And then Gulp ImageMin for processing images. Anything you got, we can handle. And then we also use a browser sync server to kind of preview this stuff live. So once again, since it is a static site, we just use kind of any old server will do, because in the end, we're just serving up basic HTML. So we will come back to this chart in a second. This is important when we get into concepts of like modularity. So once again, these are kind of the hot features. One extra feature in there, which is not in the graph, is kind of like I mentioned before, we deliver style guides to our clients. And we used to write our style guides with like a lot of raw HTML that was like run through Highlight.js. We were able to streamline that process from 5 to 6, and we created a small plugin for that called Style Sherpa, which can generate a full HTML style guide for you from a single markdown file. This is another instance where we saw kind of 2 opportunities. One was to streamline a process we had. Like it was taking designers like a day or 2 to write a full style guide just because they had to code everything by hand. So we kind of identified an opportunity to streamline an internal process and then take the tool that we wrote and give it out to the community for free. Kind of like how open source is. So we've definitely been leaning more into open source these days by taking all these useful tools that we build for ourselves and then distributing them to our community. So why Panini then? There's no shortage of static web site generators. There are whole meetups for them, so that's probably proof that there are quite a few choices out there. So why on earth did we write our own? And there are a few reasons for that. So part of it, so we were kind of surveying that landscape. We used Assemble in Foundation 5, and Assemble is a really, really nice tool. It was just kind of a combination of factors that prevented us from using a larger static site generator. Part of it was that Assemble 0.6, which was in development, was not done yet. That version was going to bring Gulp compatibility and a more flexible API, and part of it was just like, okay, well, they haven't gotten it done, which you can't knock them for because, we, like even though we at ZURB get paid to do open source, we still fully understand the problem of, not being able to commit as much time as you want to open source. So we're definitely sympathetic to that. So part of it was just, okay, we're not sure if we can stick with Assemble because it's not done yet, so we're not sure. So then we started looking for kind of smaller tools. Like, is there anything that can just do like really basic like handlebars compilation for us? And what we kind of landed on was that we just kind of needed a smaller, more focused tool. So this is actually the original version, in quotes, of Panini. This was just built in another repo where we needed a very simple gulp plugin to compile handlebars, layouts, and partials into flat files. And I could not find a plugin that just did that one specific thing, so I wrote it in about 20 lines of code. And this is almost what the actual like 1.0 of Panini looks like. It was just segmented out to have more individual files, have proper unit tests, all that stuff. But this kind of shows that the tool itself has a very like simple, humble beginnings. It was designed for one extremely specific purpose, a purpose so simple and specific that you could write it in like 20 lines of code. And eventually that was something that we did develop into a full library. So when we thought about what we needed out of a templating system, there was kind of a few things. And these are things that are common to a lot of static site generators. You know, we wanted the layout page partial model, right? Like that's the model you get out of Jekyll. That's the model you get out of like Metalsmith, or just kind of like any of these static site generators. You know, that's something that you get out of just, you know, programming languages in general, right? Like you get that out of Rails, you get that out of any old framework like that. So we needed that, of course. We needed support for like page-specific data, and we also wanted like useful helper functions for prototyping. We do a lot of prototyping with our static site tools, so like code that's not necessarily for production. So we were kind of looking at small things like, oh, can we build a tool that also maybe helps us like, you know, repeat a lot of static HTML, or can it inject placeholder data for us? We were kind of looking at a specific spin on this concept as well, where it's not quite static sites, it's more like prototype sites, because that tends to be more what ZURB's client work is about. So even when we were looking at this concept of building a static site generator, Panini is not something I would call a static site generator. I would call it a flat file compiler, which is another set of confusing words, but that's fine. So tools like Assemble, Metalsmith, Punch, like any of these node-based static site generators, they all have very big ecosystems. But one interesting thing when we were looking at those different plugins and considering them as options for our own site generator, we saw that a lot of their plugins had overlap with just task runners themselves, right? So, for example, like Metalsmith is a really awesome kind of gulp-inspired static site generator, and its whole thing is composability, right? So you pass it plugins for like, you know, templating or permalinks or like directory listings or Sass or JavaScript. It can do all of those things, and it can print a full static site for you, which is really awesome. But when you look at the functionality of that, a lot of that is already covered by the very virtue that we have a gulp build process. And to illustrate that, here is on Metalsmith's, and this is not me knocking this library at all, because I think it's really awesome, and I use it for some of my own stuff. This is the search result for like JavaScript. If you want to find like JavaScript plugins for Metalsmith, it's like, okay, they have a CoffeeScript compiler, they have an uglifier, and they have linters for ESLint and XO. So there are 4 JavaScript plugins for Metalsmith. So if you want to use Metalsmith as a static site generator, you have these 4 options for JavaScript. If Gulp is your static site generator, you have all of these options. You can suddenly then compile with like, you know, Babel, Closure Compiler, Tracer, LiveScript. You have templating options like ngHTML to JS. You have module loaders like Webpack and Browserify. You just have a lot more options. And these are all functions that static site generators tend to have. But by the virtue of us actually using a build system, we already have that functionality built in. So the fact that these other more expansive tools have those functions doesn't really matter to us necessarily. So from there, we're looking at this idea of like, okay, well, if we need to cover this one area of our template, of our static site generator, which is HTML templating, what tool are we using? Because all the existing tools are like incredibly expansive, which is a good thing, but we already have this structure built, so the tool that we need just for the HTML part can be a lot more focused. And that's where Panini comes into play, because Panini is designed to do one thing and do it very well. There's kind of a handful of development goals with there. One was very minimal configuration. So all of the features are optional except for having layouts, right? So kind of in a typical static site model, you have like common layout files, and then you inject your pages into those templates, and that's how you get flat files. So those are the only required features. Panini also supports custom handlebars helpers, external data through JSON or YAML, and it also supports external partials as well. Those are all optional features, and the only thing you need to turn them on is to just point it at a directory of files. So it's extremely low overhead in terms of configuration. It's also a very focused feature set. I'm definitely very fond of libraries and library maintainers who like to be opinionated about their work, because that prevents feature creep, that prevents your library from going out of scope, and that prevents your library from overlapping with people who might be doing other things better. right? Like we were never going to set out to actually like recreate Assemble or recreate Metalsmith or Jekyll or any of these things, because the people who do that do it really well, right? So we don't really need to get into that territory, which is why Panini is more limited in its feature set, which is intentional, because we can then focus on that one very specific goal of kind of compiling flat files, and we can let Panini exist in kind of this wider cog, or no, not a wider cog, a cog in a wider machine of kind of the full ZURB template that we have. Because of that, then it also doesn't dominate the build process. It makes it easily replaceable. So for example, one thing we've considered with the ZURB template is building yeoman generators for it. Like right now we have just one ZURB template. It only uses Panini. It only uses Sass. It doesn't have Babel. It doesn't have PostCSS. It doesn't have any of these other things that people like to use. So we've considered trying to think of the ZURB template as being more modular. So the fact that Panini is just one piece of that machine means that like our entire build system is more modular as a result, because the part where you compile the HTML is not dominating your entire build process. It's one piece, which means you can very easily swap it out. So if we kind of go back to the ZURB template, everything highlighted, those are our tasks, and below that are the plugins that we need to accomplish those tasks. So the nice thing about having a modular build system, and especially the nice thing with using Gulp, which I'll kind of illustrate when I kind of go through the code for it, is that any piece of this pipeline is immediately replaceable, because Gulp plugins are designed to all like very easily talk to each other. So if I need to replace any piece or add any piece to this build process, it's very easy. So if we zoom and enhance here, can we enhance this? And we go to the HTML part, if we want to swap out Panini for anything else, we can swap it out for like Assemble, Metalsmith, Hexo, Punch, any of these hot node static site generators. We can swap out that one piece. The entire template will still work exactly the same. But now we've been able to kind of change one piece of that technology to fit our needs, right? So for example, for the Sass part, we could add more PostCSS plugins if we wanted to. For the JavaScript piece, we could add Babel if we wanted to. For the image compression, maybe we can convert SVGs to icon fonts. There's like a lot of interesting stuff we can do there. But because our build system and our client template was designed to be modular from the start, it makes adding, removing, or modifying any piece very easy. Right, so small tools, and this is a thing that especially Node developers love to talk about, is the idea of small tools. There's a prominent Node developer named Sindrasaurus. He has published 600 Node libraries. The main reason he's published 600 Node libraries is because a lot of them are like 10 lines of code. Because his thing is like small modules. It's like, well, I solved this one problem in 10 lines of code. Like, what is the point of cutting and pasting it into other projects if I just make it like a module for you? So the Node community definitely has a fetish for small modules, and Panini kind of, that's a little harsh. I like it. And Panini definitely fits into that idea of like, this thing does one thing and it does it extremely well. And because the feature set is focused, it's very easy for us to kind of swap it out for something that fits our needs better if we need it. So along with Panini, the other big part of the ZURB template was a style guide generator that we wrote. So once again, our big focus when we do front-end code for clients is making a pattern library. Right? Like we use Foundation for all of our client work, but we are writing a lot of custom UI components for the specific designs that we made for our clients. And we want to document that because we are doing a handoff to developers, and we need to make sure that that handoff goes as smoothly as possible. So to do that, not only do we write very well-organized Sass code where every component isn't a partial, we write Sass variables when we can, we also document all of our custom components with a style guide for that specific client. And this was a somewhat arduous process. If we kind of look at an example of what that used to look like. So here's kind of what the client template would look like a kind of a stock one. Like we filled in with a few very basic Foundation components, and then our designers for specific projects will start adding their components at the bottom. So a typical style guide for client will probably have like 20 different sections, right? Like something almost the size of the Foundation documentation, because there's so much kind of custom stuff that we wrote for them that we need to document. Now the process for writing this used to look something like this. It was one very long HTML file. If you wanted to do a code sample with a live demo, you had to wrap it in pre-encode tags so that it would run through Highlight.js, and you had to not indent it, or it would indent the code sample and mess up the formatting. So your entire style guide was this huge HTML file with a lot of weird indentation and like alternation like this. And this was a thing where like we accepted it for a while because it was just how we did things, but we had to eventually find a way to make this stuff easier. So to do that, this was, once again, a thing like with Panini where we wrote this very small library for one specific use case and realized it would actually be useful as a package that we distribute to people. So now we can actually write it in Markdown. And we have like a custom Markdown parser in there that can take HTML samples and automatically render the live demo. So you aren't doing this nonsense of like doubling up all your code to show a code sample in a demo. You're doing it all through Markdown in one page, and it creates a full HTML style guide for you. And yeah, once again, like we made it for one client, and then that was a matter of cutting and pasting the code into a new project, making it into an actual library with tests and all that, and then distributing it that as a node package. And that package is called Style Sherpa. Style Sherpa in general is less than 100 lines of code. That's another testament to, once again, like how small it is, because it is designed to do one specific thing, which is convert Markdown to an HTML style guide. And because the tool itself is very simple, it's not very hard to maintain, and we kind of always know what the feature set there is. Like we could have built it into Panini, but that would also require maybe overextending Panini beyond what we wanted, kind of beyond what we wanted to keep it as a simple tool. So with that, we ended up with kind of 2 different plugins for that. So in conclusion, before I get into the code for that, definitely a core tenet of Foundation increasingly is kind of making complex ideas feel accessible. So if you go back to when like CSS frameworks were a new concept, just like the very existence of responsive grids kind of made responsive layout a little bit more palatable to people. It helped people understand this idea that, okay, maybe on this layout, if you have 3 sections, they all stack on each other on mobile. But on a mid-sized screen, maybe you have like a 2-up layout, and on a larger screen, you have like a 3-up layout. And responsive grids made that very easy to kind of understand because we have class structures for that. Now we have Sass mixin libraries for that. And we're able to kind of solve those problems of responsive layout and then kind of distribute that to our users. So we do the same thing, with the ZURB template, right? Like we, there's definitely a big portion of our audience that is designers, not engineers. So they're not going to necessarily be as familiar with all of the bleeding edge of like front-end web development. And the bleeding edge is a complete pain in the ass to work with. I probably spend an hour or 2 a day just like helping people get out of NPM issues through no fault of their own. Just the fact that this stuff is so easy to break and like configurations are so easy to mess up that you can spend a lot of time fighting with build systems. So with that, we said, okay, like if we're going to kind of go all in on this concept of using build systems, we want to create this scaffold for our users that is going to kind of make that feel accessible. Like here's everything, we have it set up for you. We even built the GUI tool of Yeti Launch to even make the process of installing those templates a lot easier as well. So we're definitely big on making our ideas accessible to people. And I believe this is my last slide, but do not clap yet because I have other stuff to show. So since most of you guys have not seen Gulp, I thought I would kind of demo how our client template works and kind of show how Gulp kind of fits into this concept of thinking about a static site generator or a build system as a series of modular components. So this is a kind of in development iteration of the ZURB template. It has all the same functionality, but we upgraded it from Gulp 3 to Gulp 4. And we also write our build system file in ES6 now, or rather ES 2015. So basically the way that Gulp works is you kind of think about your build system as a series of tasks. So if you go back to that sketch of the tree I had, each of those top level things are a different task. Right, so for example, we need to clean our distribution folder every time we start. We need to copy static assets. We need to compile our HTML templates into flat HTML files. We need to generate a style guide. We need to convert Sass into CSS. We need to convert JavaScript into compressed concatenated JavaScript. We need to compress our images to make them tiny. And then we also need to run a browser sync server so that we can preview our changes in real time and not hit Command R every time we save something. So those are kind of the elementary pieces of our build system. And what Gulp does is it makes it easy to compartmentalize all that functionality so that it's easy to kind of reason about. Now, Gulp's big innovation, I guess, or its big thing is that it uses node streams to process files. So what a node stream does is it sends a file down what you might call a series of tubes. So you start with a single file, like maybe a Sass file, an HTML file, a JavaScript file. You run it through all these different plugins one at a time, and then you get your finished plugin, or you get your finished file out at the end. So Sass probably has the longest pipeline here. So for example, here with Sass, we start with our main Sass file. Like our goal is to get it to CSS, but to get it there, we're going to run it through like 5 or 6 different plugins. So the first thing that we do is we run it through Sass itself. So that's going to convert our Sass to CSS. So now for the rest of the pipeline, it's dealing with a CSS file versus a Sass file. We then run it through AutoPrefixer. AutoPrefixer is expecting to get a CSS file that it can then prefix and spit out to the next plugin. So because Sass converted our Sass to CSS for us, we know that that's going to work. Next, we're going to pipe it through UnCSS. for production builds. We're then going to send it to Minify CSS, which is going to compress it. We're then going to send it through a source mapper, so we get source maps in our browser. And then finally, we get our finished CSS file, which we then dump out to the disk. And then that is what the user is actually seeing in their browser. So once again, since Gulp's whole thing is streams and plugins that are not aware of each other, it makes your build system highly modular. So for example, if you know you're never going to use on CSS, removing it from your build process is as easy as commenting it out. All right, so now it's going to go source maps, sass, auto prefixer, minify, source maps, dest. It's just going to skip that one piece entirely. And that's totally fine because auto prefixer spits out CSS and minify CSS takes in CSS. So those two plugins are technically still compatible even though they have no idea what the other one is. So this is really awesome in terms of like a way that we can kind of maintain our build process, because if we want to add a new feature, it's very easy. So for example, some people we had a feature request recently to add a plugin called Gulp Notify. What Gulp Notify does is it actually adds a push notification when a task finishes. So adding that is as easy as installing the plugin for it and then adding Notify and then saying sass finished. And that's all you have to do. Right? So it's entirely compatible with the rest of our build process. All we had to do was add one extra line of code, and then our entire build system was still working the exact same way. So when we talk about Panini, that's where we kind of get into this concept of modularity kind of helping us out, right? Like some static site generators have full CLIs that mandate a certain directory structure. Some static site generators do more than we need this one specific thing to do. But if we need a more robust tool, it would be very easy to remove Panini, right? So this is basically how it works. This is what it looks like when it's fully configured. Pretty much all you have to do is just pass in the names of folders. You don't have to give it file extensions or glob matching or anything like that. You just give it a name of folders, and then it will take in all of your HTML pages, and it will give you flat files out on the other side. And if we wanted to run this to any other stuff, we could. So for example, for Foundation for emails, for Inc., have any of you guys ever done HTML emails before? You're familiar with what a nightmare process that is? This guy. So the way HTML emails work is you can't have external CSS. All of your CSS has to be inline on the style attributes of the tags. That is literally how an HTML email works. I think I can even find an example for you. Let's do that. So we go in here, and then here. So here's all of our inline CSS. This is literally because most email clients don't like external CSS. You have to take a normal CSS file and put all of the individual properties on the tags. That is how HTML email works. All of you, none of you raise your hand except 2 people. You are all extremely lucky that you don't have to do this. And to be fair, I don't have to do this. My coworkers do. So a build process is something that you could do this with. So if we were to go back to our other template, so let's say that this was actually an email generator, but we still wanted to use Panini to have a full templating engine for our emails. So after we run it through our emails, we might use the Gulp plugin for inlining CSS. All right, so we'd say inline CSS, which is a plugin. We might use Minify HTML, which is another Gulp plugin. So it's very easy for us to tack on new plugins to a process just by adding a single line of code. And that is because of the kind of nature of node streams, right? They're just built around a plugin takes in a file, and then it spits out a file, and that's all it knows how to do. So as long as the adjacent plugins know how to use the same file format, you're totally fine. So this is actually what our Foundation for Emails template kind of does. It runs your emails through Panini. It inlines your CSS to make the monstrosity you see here. And then it also compresses the CSS with Minify HTML to compress the HTML to make your email even smaller. So once again, that's just the basic idea that composability can create for really powerful build systems. It reduces your reliance on any specific technology, right? If we were to use, maybe for example, in our documentation, we have a few custom tools. If we were to just use Jekyll for our tool set, if one day we didn't have a feature from Jekyll, we would have to hope that a plugin existed for that. But because our build system is completely modular and every single piece is isolated, it's very easy for us to swap out technologies whenever we need them. And we think that's extremely powerful for us as developers of Foundation and also for our users of Foundation as well. So, all right, yeah, so that's what I got there. Thank you guys so much for listening. There are some @ again. And if you guys have any questions about stuff we do with Foundation, please let me know.
Sharpness sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I don't quite understand what it does yet. But
All right. All right, I can roll with that. So let's let's actually open that up. So I have, this is the boilerplate for the ZURB template. It comes with a page called Style Guide. So this is an HTML style guide. It just uses like a basic like tab group to kind of organize things. And we give you kind of these 5 like stock categories that are just things that are common in Foundation. So this entire template is generated from one markdown file. So if I go into the code for that, I have, it's kind of hard to see this layout. I have a folder called Style Guide, and I have this markdown file that just does all this stuff. So basically, it takes every H1 it sees, and it converts that into a single page. Since it's all written in Markdown, it's a lot easier to write. It's a lot easier to work with code samples. So I could add a new section down here, 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's say that I'm going to do one for a section. That's what it is. And then I can go in here and I can add some like paragraphs of text. You know, the formatting is a lot easier because I can just use Markdown for things. I can bold things. I can add links. That's very easy. And the main hot thing here is code samples. So writing a code sample is easy enough. So I can like, you know, have some kind of button here. And when I render that, it's still running. So now I have a new section here. And it converted all my Markdown to HTML. It also ran our code sample through Highlight.js to highlight it properly. But a common thing when you make style guides is you need to show the live sample below. So that is as easy as adding HTML_example to this. And now when I refresh, I get a full sample below it. And this seems like a small thing, but it's actually like something that people didn't always automate. Like people would, like especially like with our style guides, we would paste the HTML sample, like hope there were no special characters that would break it in the pre-tags, and then put the live demo below. Even in the Foundation documentation itself, we were actually writing both of these things by hand. So literally just by writing one very simple Markdown function, you can kind of extend the Markdown like code fencing syntax to allow for this. So those are kind of the main things that we do there. We are interested in kind of expanding this tool to maybe make concepts like generating color palettes easier, things like that. But for now, it's basically a way to streamline a process we already have and make it probably take like half the time. So.
Thanks. So is that sort of like the template for SuperClider or something? Or?
Yeah. Oh, you were the guy who tweeted at me about this.
No.
Oh, no, you're not? Okay, never mind. A guy tweeted at me about SuperClider, and I was amazed somebody did that. This is very similar. I actually borrowed the same code snippet from that. So SuperClider is our documentation generator. Its whole thing is that it combines data from multiple documentation generators into one, whereas like tools like SassDoc, JSDoc will give you a stock template. This one is designed to take things from multiple languages and mash them into one. But yeah, we have this exact same thing in the Markdown parser for that one because this specific thing is something that we use all the time in our documentation. So literally just being able to not cut and paste things saves us a ton of time in writing documentation. James, you had a question?
Yeah, my question was, is it just limited to like HTML examples?
Well, so part of it is that you can't like really render a Sass or a CSS example. Like the reason this one works is because you're just taking HTML code and then pasting it below the code sample. So it doesn't have support for CSS because if you do that, like what exactly are you previewing below it? So for now, it is mostly for HTML. I mean, you could maybe use it for something like JSX or something, but I think that's about it. Yeah. You could. I can. You know, we're not going to encourage that, but realistically, none of the tools that we write, because like front-end frameworks are just CSS mostly, so it tends to be pretty environment agnostic. I'll share a secret with you. Here's the config file. I'm not going to do this, but you know, you could replace that Bower package. So yes, it is possible to use this stack with not Foundation. Actually, the style guide would break because it uses Foundation CSS, but everything else is totally agnostic. Just don't tell my boss I said that. What do you have a question? Thought I saw a hand raised. There's one in the back.
A couple over there.
So when you're actually writing HTML, what are you using for templating? What does it look like?
We use handlebars. So if I go to my base layout here, we use handlebars for our templating, mostly because it is probably the easiest to kind of grasp in terms of the syntax. Like if we compare it to like Lodash, which has like 2 whole symbols, things like that, or like Slim or J templates, which use that kind of Python style, like only indented syntax. HTML tends to be the easiest for people to understand, we found, because it can layer on top of HTML very easily, and it's just 2 curly braces, so it's also a lot easier to type. So that's why we tend to use handlebars. We might extend this tool eventually to have multiple, like a guy asked us if we could add Jade support, but for now it's just handlebars.
Did you look at JSX?
We did not, no. I mean, that would definitely be interesting. I've not actually seen JSX used for client-side templating, mainly because I've not seen it used outside of a React context, but that would definitely be interesting to kind of look at. What's up?
Is there concept of front matter throughout the templates?
Yeah, there is front matter support. So any individual page can have a front matter block. So part of that is like if you want to like change the layout, you can do that. So if you have multiple layouts, like maybe if you have like a blog or something, you can do that. But you can also insert whatever metadata you want. Like if I want an important list of breakfasts, I can say, and then that will be injected as a handlebars variable. So I can say like each breakfast. And then I can iterate through that very easily. It is also possible to inject global data. So you can define a data folder, and you can put in JSON or YAML files, and it will inject those for every single page at once. So it is possible to get in static data through that way as well. So you can do page level, and you can do global data.
Is there any way to have pages that doesn't have like a one-to-one correspondence?
Right. So that is one thing that Paint does not do. It can't make like a directory listing for you. That is something we could add, but that then get back to this idea of like we use this for more prototyping than static sites, which is why we don't have some of those features. But that is something kind of on a list of features that we would like to explore. So I had mentioned that maybe we would do more stuff with like rich data in these style guides, and one example I gave was generating color palettes. So if we look in here, we give you this kind of basic section for defining a color palette. The way that is made is just with HTML. So there could be, right, so like this is all just handwritten HTML, which is annoying because this is structured data. So you shouldn't have to write out HTML by hand for something that is structured data. So if there are ways that we can do things like that for colors or typography or like very basic elementary elements that you would always display the same way, I would definitely like to explore that. Like if it's something like, oh, you have a front matter block and you give it an array of colors and it generates that code for you, something like that. Part of that is because we know that people using these tools, like for our, not just our clients, but now that this tool is for our users as well, we are trying to get our users to think harder about how they use a framework. So for example, that's why we bundle uncss in there. Like if we can find ways to avoid that statistic of, 90% of framework code goes unused, then we would like to try for that. Like we've actually deployed, our entire foundation marketing site is built on this thing. So we have deployed production sites to it. So in those cases, we do need asset minification for that. But you are totally right that for our clients, it usually matters less, but in some cases, our clients aren't always aware of those practices in some cases, so making them aware of that is definitely like a good thing in our eyes.